All right.
June, June, please help me.
What's your name?
My name is Maria.
I'm John. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
All
you,
right.
John.
So basically, what I'm doing here today is we're sitting out and.
Oh my God, that cup is so funny.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about guns and gun control, and well, I'm obviously pro-gun, and if anyone wants to come up and try and change my mind about my views or educate me on things that they know, that's really what I try and talk about. Or the other way around, if I want to talk like someone else and see if I can change your mind about gun control. It's just basically supposed to be a productive discussion.
Okay.
So what are your feelings on gun control?
In general, I feel like I'm pretty anti-gun. I think that I respect other people's rights to like bear arms, but like for me personally, like guns very much intimidate me, and with my perspective, I feel like they do cause a lot of violence, but I can see like why people would want to have them as a source of security. I just don't think that like you need, I guess maybe bigger guns.
Bigger guns?
Like,
okay.
Open carry kind of intimidates me too,
Yep.
but if you want to feel safe, like that's your right. And then I definitely think that, I don't think that we should like ban guns like totally. I think that we just need to have better security on who has access to guns, like better background checks, and like in general, I'm not very informed about it.
That's fine. Well, that's actually, I think one of our major issues with gun legislation is the fact that not many people who are making those decisions are very informed on it. I think people, they take a look at general things, they'll watch the news, they'll see something about it, but it's always secondhand. It's not usually breaking down good statistics and really vetting them and figuring out exactly what our issues are.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent. I think most of gun violence is 100% due to mental health. Like the majority of it, mental health and issues, especially with gang violence. But the thing is, we talk about statistics like gun deaths, right? And gun deaths a year. We have like around 30,000 a year in the United States. And at least 2/3 to 80%, right? So around 60 to 80% of that is suicide, which is definitely a mental health issue. That's something that, that I feel that that's more of a choice of suicide rather than an issue with guns inherently, and more of a mental health issue. So I like to break down more of the actual like homicide statistics, which is around like 1/3 of that. So we're talking somewhere in the nature plus or minus 10,000 deaths a year. So what I think is the gun control legislation that is proposed and has been proposed. Something in Virginia recently was magazine restrictions. They tried to pass that. I know under the Obama administration they also did that. Trump just banned bump stocks. That ban just went into effect on the 26th. So we've had a couple attempts at gun control legislation. Some have stuck, some haven't. But especially with things like magazine restrictions, we talk about that in a common sense way, and you hear that thrown around all the time, common sense gun control, which is something that sounds nice, but has to have a definition.
Yeah.
So I'm all for background checks. I think background checks are a really good thing. And we want to know that somebody isn't a felon, somebody's not violent. Those people, I think we can all basically, unless you're more of an anarchist, right, sit behind and say, we don't want people who have prior violent crimes, have serious mental health issues, because they're at higher risk, and it's for their safety as well as everyone else's. So I think that's a place where the government can step in and say, these people can't have guns. And we have that with, if you have a violent felony, you can't own a gun.
Okay.
If you have, if you have prior history, every gun needs a background check. You've got to go through the ATF, and it's a pretty thorough system. There are sometimes issues. We've seen that with some paperwork and things not getting transferred over, which is something I think we should always strive to get better at.
Yeah.
But things you talked about bigger guns, right? What exactly would you prescribe for bigger guns?
The only one that I know of is an AK-47, but just the ones that are like, I just feel like you don't need them necessarily unless you're in the military. Like the weapons that you see that cause like mass shootings, those I feel like there needs to be more restrictions on who gets access to those, because in my head I don't really see why regular civilians need them. So that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I like to talk about is with mass shootings is we see a lot with when we talk about mass shootings, we think about stuff like maybe like an AK-47 or maybe like an AR-15 is one. Oh, sorry, we got the planes going over. Hold on a second. Those are very loud. But yeah, so you see something like an AK-47 or an AR-15, which are common guns. The lingo's been around for a while.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness.
They're taking their time.
Yeah, I know. Very loud. That's what we get living next to a military base, but that's good. But actually, 80% of mass shootings are perpetrated with handguns, which is something that I don't think a lot of people know. I think that's something that when we see mass shootings, we usually think of somebody running in with a big rifle and gunning everyone down.
Yeah.
But we have specific laws on the books. Like if you're 18, you're allowed to legally buy a rifle, but you're not allowed to buy a handgun because handguns are easily concealable and commit the vast majority of homicides with a gun in the United States. So I think legislation like that makes a little more sense, you know.
Yeah.
While I'm not 100% full sale because I'm a big proponent of firearms and I'm an avid user of firearms, and I think it's very important for multiple reasons, including self-defense. I think hunting gets a little overblown. I feel like, you know, hunting is something that is a reason to have firearms, but it's not the primary reason to have firearms. I think.
Do you hunt yourself?
I don't personally. Well, there's some turtles in my lake that we shoot because they're bad for the ecosystem. They snapping turtles will mess up, so we try and control the population that way. And they're tough. I tell you what, like I've seen them. They can take a little bit. But so we talk about handguns versus a long gun, right? So a rifle. There's differences with the calibers. I can have a rifle that shoots a bullet that's about that big, or I can have a rifle that shoots a bullet that's about that big. So I think that's something we don't talk about as much as the caliber. You know, if we want to talk about specifics on what is more dangerous, when you've got something that shoots a higher caliber, if I shot, so you're familiar with BB guns, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so and then there's things like air rifles right before you get to a firearm. And, air rifles, some can shoot a metal projectile at a fairly decent velocity, and if you would step over that, a .22 is like about the next step up from that. It's an actual bullet, but it's not a lot of power behind it, and it's about that big, and it wouldn't kill someone even if you shot someone with it. It's not. You shouldn't shoot someone with it. Don't try that. Yes, but it's something like that versus like a 7.62 or a military style round, like you got 5.56. Some of the bigger guns will shoot that, and then there's much larger rounds which are totally impractical if somebody commits a murder or something along that lines. Usually it's a handgun with something like a .45 caliber or a 9mm, which is standard. It's what a police officer would carry, So that sort of thing is doing the majority of shootings. We see things kind of like the Vegas shooter who used long guns and just absolutely unspeakable things. And we want to stop stuff like that. But it's very hard with somebody like that because there was no prior signs. There's nothing that tips you off. So what do you think people could do, and we could do as a country to help people like that to stop getting guns, or just try our best and not try and catch everyone else with that? People who do respectfully use guns, and I mean, in the United States, for every 100 people, there's about 88.8 guns. So we have a large, and that's not 88 out of 100 people.
Okay. I was like, wow,
but there's 88 guns, so people own multiple, it ends up balancing out, but it's a really high ownership rate.
Yeah.
So to help those people, because that's millions and hundreds of millions of Americans, theoretically, statistically, own firearms and don't use them in bad ways and evil actions. What do you do to help those people, but also stop, gun violence as we can?
Oh my God.
I know it's a rough question. This is why legislation doesn't get passed. It's not very easy. But what's a logical step we can take? I think that's something we should walk down.
Honestly, I feel like I can't really answer that just because like I'm not informed very well about like guns, and I think that everything that you said within like the past 5-10 minutes has definitely been a lot more than I've heard within however long I've been paying attention.
Yeah.
But I think what first comes to mind, like when you ask me that question, is definitely like the mental health thing. Is like I think as a country we're getting better at pushing mental health and the fact that mental health is important to discuss because where I stand on guns, it's definitely about like the mass shootings and how do we prevent gun violence like that. And so just pushing. I agree with you that we need to push mental health more.
Yep.
And so I feel like that's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing. What I don't like is restrictions and talks of trying to ban certain things. Like you talk about something like semi-automatic weapons. What are your stance on maybe a semi-automatic weapon?
Can you give me an example of one?
All right, so basically, you have an automatic weapon, which you would pull the trigger, and it would continue to fire until you release the trigger. A semi-automatic weapon, which would be one bullet comes out every time you pull the trigger, and then there's things like a bolt-action rifle, where you actually have to move, like physically yourself, pull the action, which is how the casing of the last bullet is ejected and the next bullet's loaded. So you have to physically do that yourself. So it goes physically doing it yourself, you pull the trigger and it happens, but you have to pull it again, or continuous cycle when you hold down the trigger. It's very, very hard to get an automatic weapon. You must go. It's a thoroughly vetted thing. You have to get your own special license for it. So that's not really an issue in the United States. We don't have people going around with automatic weapons.
So it's more so like semi-automatic and then lower.
Yeah,
like
semi. Yeah, so that's where it is. And people have talked about, New Zealand actually just banned all semi-automatic weapons after the shooting they had, and they had incredibly low rates of violent crime, murder, and gun crime. Something around one homicide with a gun every 10 years. They have extremely low rates.
I suppose maybe New Zealand has been looking at like what's been happening in our country within like the past decade, and maybe they are just doing that because out of fear that like that will happen to them. I don't know if in their constitution maybe they have a right to bear arms for their citizens, because that's where like I would feel like maybe you would be coming from, like, oh, like that's not right to ban semi-automatic weapons just after one incident. So I think I would have to look into the constitution to see why they did that. But coming from my leftist perspective, I think when I saw that made me a little bit like, okay, that's good, like. But I suppose maybe to you that was like too extreme of a step.
Well, to explain why I think that's too extreme of a step, semi-automatic weapons are about 90% of guns, right? So what we're talking about is a lot of hunting rifles. Some are bolt action, some are semi-automatic. Usually that's not an argument that really holds too much water. Some people prefer doing that. A lot use their bolt, and they're fine with that. But with home defense, right? If you wanted to carry a sidearm for home defense, you have to have a semi-automatic weapon. If you look at any like police footage, when unfortunately there's an altercation or maybe the gun is discharged, one bullet is not going to be enough, and in stressful, high, intense situations, say if you have a home intruder, that's not going to be enough to have a gun that you'll have to manually reload every time. So it worries me for them that they've taken away all these guns. So it's essentially a gun ban outright in most senses, because it takes away so many that at this point it makes it criminal. I also have an issue with some of their other legislation around the Shooter's Manifesto, where if you own a copy of it, you can go to jail for 10 or 11 years. If you spread one, it's like 14 is the maximum, which I
at that point it's a limitation of freedom of speech.
Exactly. And that's one thing that I really appreciate is things like freedom of speech, right? Something that our country is afforded and doesn't happen anywhere else in the same way that we have it. It's a fundamental right for us.
Yeah.
And I think that is so important, and we should preserve those things. Most people, on any side of the political spectrum, when you talk about free speech, will be pro-free speech. We'll have a debate on sometimes where the line is of things. Usually it's when it's inciting violence, when it's a violent speech, a call to action, things like that, And we'll have disagreements on that, but that's really not, that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But with the Second Amendment, I think that's another important thing that we have in our country that's based off of the fact that the government has to still, account, like the people have to account for the people.
Yeah.
It protects against a tyrannical government from the fact that you have an armed populace. So if you were to overstep your boundaries so far, the populace has a way to fight back. The same way that something like during the Holocaust, you had the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where they got like a few firearms, and they caused a gigantic splash for the Nazis when they came in, and it was just it was a bunch of Jewish people who got their hands on firearms and were able to resist and rebel. Not saying that that's going to happen today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, but you never know where your government's going to go, because in all governments, corruption breeds, and we take different routes, and depending on where we go, it's another reason why I'm the small government guy, is because I don't like when the government has too much power, because they can change things really easily, and it sort of steps over democracy. Something like an executive order. Our last few presidents have all used a lot of executive orders, and I am not a fan of that, because that's not how our government's intended to run. There's a reason why it's hard to pass bills through the House and the Senate. It's because the framers designed it that way so we didn't make stupid decisions. And I know Republicans when Obama was in office, and Democrats when Trump is in office, they look at executive orders and they say, I didn't want that. Or in certain cases, there are things we can all get behind, but it gives too much power, and I'm just not a fan of that. I really want, if they have power, something to be accountable for, If you try and overstep your boundaries, be fearful of the public. And that's, and that's another reason the United States can never be land invaded. There's no way we can ever be invaded, because there's 88.8 guns per person. So not only would you have to deal with our military, you'd also have to deal with our citizenry. It's an impossible battle to win. So those are some of the things, I think self-defense is huge. I think people underrate the amount of self-defense that happens. The FBI, there's a great FBI statistic on it that from the low end is 500,000 to 3 million lives each year are saved by the proactive use of firearms. And that's not brandishing, that's not having it on your side and someone gets scared. That's actually pulling out and use of a firearm, which I think is a really important thing to remember when we talk about, even with those suicides, 30,000, 35,000 gun deaths per year versus that 500,000 to 3 million number. I think if we restrict too much, you might be harming the bigger number there, and you might see more issues than you'll solve at the end. So that's my train of thought. But you have anything else you want to add?
Nope. Honestly, I feel like I just sat here and got schooled.
Oh,
but
no.
That's okay, because honestly, I don't know much about the gun issues, and I feel like definitely in this age when you have control of your own social media, you'll only see things that you agree with. And so either way, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you sitting down, because it's a good way to get out of that, because you don't always sit down with someone who disagrees with you, and especially if you're not sure and you don't understand what's going on. It's nice to sit down with someone else, and even if you think you know what's going on, you sit down, you might want to, talk to some people about it. It's nice getting fresh ideas and talking to people who are fresh in a situation, because sometimes you need that, and that will, change your outlook. But I appreciate you sitting down with me today.
Thank
you. All right, thank you. Thank you for coming.
How much longer do you have to sit here?
I'm gonna go for a while.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've all right. What's going on?
Nothing much.
All right. State your name.
My name's Zach Swanson.
All right. How do you feel about guns? Right.
What about them?
Gun control, you know. I'm pro-gun, so how do you feel about guns?
What do you mean by you're pro-gun?
Like, I'm pro-Second Amendment, you know.
That you should be able to have a gun?
Yeah, minimalist restrictions on it.
Minimalist as in, what do you define as minimalist?
You know, that's a hard one because you talk about sensible gun control, but and common sense gun control is something that's thrown around a lot. I think most of the current gun control legislation that's being proposed around the United States and in places like New Zealand recently is completely overbearing and is going far past what it should.
I'm not familiar with the New Zealand laws on gun control. However, I think that the common sense law should only apply if you can assume that everyone has the common sense to use the gun in a proper way. But I don't think that you can make that assumption based on the current U.S. population.
So what do you think should be done about guns?
I think that it should be controlled in a way that you evaluate the potential buyer so that you know that they will handle it responsibly and not in a bad way.
All right, so you're for, you know, more fervent like background checks?
Oh yeah.
Would you say?
I mean, I don't think that anyone should be able to get a gun because the prevalence of mental disorders and depression and anxiety in the United States is so high that those are what lead to things like killings. I don't think that the majority of people who buy guns do those things, but it's for the select few that do to protect against that.
So that's actually a really interesting point about the amount of people who do commit mass shootings.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's
very small.
Usually,
It's
what
not very likely.
there's something called the 80-20 principle. You may have heard of it in a lot of statistical fields, right? There's a weird statistical breakdown that things usually go to 80s and 20s, right? So that follows in a lot of gun statistics, like with suicides as gun deaths as a whole. So gun deaths is how many people are killed by firearms every year, and suicide is actually around 80% of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a little less depending on what statistics you're using, but it is by far the majority of gun deaths, which is a huge issue with mental health. It's not really a firearm restriction. That's where I see. I don't think that's as much a firearm restriction as if we had people going around shooting each other all the time. But I think the focus on that sort of legislation isn't aimed at the right things. They talk about like AR-15s and assault rifles, which assault rifles
for mass killings and things like that, which aren't as prevalent as suicide.
But mass shootings are actually committed mostly with handguns. That's another 80-20 rule. 80% are committed with handguns and not long rifles.
As in pistol?
Yeah.
Guns?
Yep.
Okay. Well, the research that I've done on mass killings, which I'm in a class right now, which has been talking about mass killings, a lot of it has been done with assault rifles.
Well,
some of the biggest mass killings in this country's history, which most of the mass killings range between like 50 deaths and like 10 deaths, 5 deaths.
Yep.
So it's not a huge amount of people that die from these things, but the more power that your gun has, obviously will allow you to fire more arms more quickly on a mass crowd.
And I think that's actually where a lot of it goes wrong is when you say the more power your gun has, you know, that follows like a logical train of thought, because you go through and you say, well, if something's a higher caliber, it's going to do more damage, so we should look at things differently. But instead, we look at a platform. When you say assault rifle or say AR-15, that AR-15 can shoot a bullet that's about this big, or it can shoot a bullet that's like that big.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an entire different scale. And what we don't talk about is, which is another part of the 80-20 principle, because it breaks down really, really nicely into these groups, so we can talk about it, is of that section that's not of gun deaths, that's not suicide, the leftover portion is about 80% gang violence. Yeah. There's a huge problem with gang, and that's where you see most what we define as mass shootings, which is 4 or more people killed. And the reason why it's perpetrated with handguns most often is because they're easy to conceal, and that's why you can buy a long rifle at 18 and you can't buy a handgun until you're 21.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of legislation makes sense to me. You know, that's something that we have in place that takes something like concealing a weapon, something that's easier to bring in, let's say like in a backpack in a school or something, you know, because that's the stuff we want to avoid. And if you go about it legally and you're a legal citizen and you've got, you know, you work by the laws of the country, then that should theoretically help. One thing I have issues with is the illegal, like people illegally obtaining guns.
Yeah.
And one thing to talk about New Zealand, because New Zealand was the most recent, you know, mass shooting that we've seen in Christchurch. Basically, they have legislation on they need license to buy firearms, and they have magazine restrictions, which we've had. But the main issue I have with magazine restrictions is some place like New Zealand that has extremely low murder rates and even lower gun violence. It is about one homicide every 10 years in New Zealand for like one homicide every 10 years with a gun. So it's extremely low amounts of homicide, and they have magazine restrictions. And they take the magazine restriction, and the guy who just committed that atrocity sits there and he illegally gets a magazine that carries more rounds than he's allowed to have.
Yeah.
So one thing that's wrong about people really pushing too much gun legislation is that some people who are going to do these things, like if people who can snap, and you can't always find who has mental illness.
Yeah.
And with things like magazine restrictions and others like that, it's just, there's so much room for people to break those boundaries, and especially if they want to do something that's highly illegal already, it's something that's hard to control. But what do you think about how do we stop mentally ill people from having firearms?
How would you stop it?
Yeah.
I know.
That's a good question. That's hard because I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I'm not the one who's gonna make the groundbreaking legislation on it, but it's definitely a hard thing to do, is to measure intention, because same thing with suicide. Even those who attempt suicide, they might not have had the intent to kill themselves. They might have just had the intent to get attention or to raise some awareness. So intent is definitely one aspect of it, but with mental illness, it's harder to predict your intent because you fluctuate in your mood so much and your mindset. I think that for those who have mental illness, the best way would be to have some kind of psychiatrist examine them before, but it's unpractical when it comes to gun buying at the large rate that it is. I don't know if it would be possible or even practical to be able to do something like that, but I think that is kind of the best way.
That would be ideal, you know, if we could sit down and vet every single person and, you know, have an interview, look at their family history and all that. But then sometimes when you talk about that, you get into the subjectivity of who's making that decision. You know, who has the right to tell you that you're mentally not capable of doing that.
Camera right here.
Yeah, we're going right now. But yeah, who gets that call, and how do you do it in a way where it's not a catch-all net that catches way more than it needs to and takes rights away from people who are doing the right thing and just want to protect themselves? So it's a hard problem, but it sounds like the focus is on mental health, and I think that's where the focus should be. You know, it's because
those who have wrong intent are usually something wrong with their.
Yeah, if you have a felony already, you can't buy a firearm. If you've a violent, you know, felony, you can't buy these things already. It takes 2 seconds. If you punch someone in the street and the cops get you and you get a felony, you can't buy a firearm anymore.
Yeah.
So we have rules on the books to say, you know what, if you have precedent of doing violent things or being a violent person, or if you have issues with mental health, you know, we bar you from doing these things. Sometimes these systems don't work as well. We saw that with, I believe, it was one of the shootings in Texas where I think he was a former Air Force guy, got bought a firearm even though he had a domestic violence charge, which he wasn't allowed to do, but there was an issue with the paperwork, and he committed a mass shooting.
When was that?
I believe it was like, I can't say for sure, but it was on 3 years ago, something like that. But it's stuff like that that's so hard, because I'm all for making a more robust system,
Yeah.
you know, where we can really vet out these things, and helping our background checks catch better, you know. But it's hard. It's a hard system because we have 350 million people, and they all have the same rights and the right to bear arms. So it's.
I think you have another take here.
Yeah, it's a tough one. All right. Well, thank you
for your
sitting
time,
down and talking. I appreciate it.
Mr. Piper. Enjoy your.
It's good. How you doing? You want to sit down?
I'm getting food.
All right. All right.
Chat for a bit.
All right. Sounds good.
That's all Jordan to come over.
Yeah.
She'll fight with me.
Oh, really?
Jordan Murray?
Yeah. Oh, good.